Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As introduced by Mohammed, my name is Anne-Lise. I'm Director CEO at ARPAS-UK. And this webinar today is in connection with the regulation special interest group activities that we have started at the beginning of this year. So first thing first, what is SORA? SORA stands for Specific Operations Risk Assessment, and it is a safety methodology to assess risk, provide proportionate risk mitigations for all operations within the specific category. SORA is developed by a group called JARUS, and JARUS is made of a number of aviation experts from 60 plus countries, mostly, but not limited to, members of national aviation authorities such as the UK CAA, the FAA in the US, or EASA in Europe. So you see that little map that contributors within the JARUS working groups and activities really cover the whole map. We're doing this introduction to version 2.5, but it's important to note that actually JARUS published a version 2.0 back in 2019, and that 2.0 version is implemented in a number of countries across the world. And some of you may have used it actually outside of the UK. The main difference between 2.0 and 2.5 will be the quantification of the ground risk. And there will be, for your information, another future version, 3.0, that will cover the quantification of the air risk. So where are we in terms of that version 2.5? JARUS published a first draft open for consultation back in March 2023. They received some 1,000 comments, and they are now in the process of amending that first draft to reflect those comments. And it is expected that the final release would be available by Q1 and Q1 of 2024. In the presentation, you will see on some of the slides a little label, possible update. That's because I attended a conference a couple of weeks ago organized by our counterpart in Germany called UEVIDAR, and some keynote speakers were members of JARUS or EASA, and they shared some unofficial possible updates of that initial draft, because, you know, obviously they've been working on including relevant comments that they had received. So I'm just informing you, and I will remind you when we are hitting those slides. We don't know, there could be some additional changes, so the final version may be different. But when that final version is published, at least we will all know how to spot the differences. In terms of other differences, it's also important to note that the UK CAA announced that they would recommend or adopt, I don't know how we should phrase it, a UK version of SORA 2.5 as an acceptable means of compliance with UK regulations. And for now, we don't know what these possible variations of SORA would be implemented in the UK. It could be in relation to the specificities of UK airspace. I mean, we don't know. But in any event, again, it's interesting and valuable to understand the international baseline to be in a position to measure the variations from a UK perspective. If you allow me, I will start by a few slides on SORA 2.0 and 2.5, so overall, so that for those of you, and I suppose most of you, who have never opened the documentation of SORA methodology, you have an overall understanding of SORA, how it works, and some of the key conclusions. So the first thing is that SORA only deals with safety. It doesn't deal with environmental risk. It doesn't deal with privacy or anything of that sort. It is purely in relation to safety, safety being harm being a fatality, either on the ground or in the air, following a mid-air collision with a crewed aircraft. And safety is usually expressed as a number of fatality per flying hours. So SORA is a safety methodology. Its objective is that all drone UAS operations meet a certain level of safety called TLOS, target level of safety. SORA established the numbers that are in this table based on, and I will almost, the topic is so important, that TLOS and that target, that I could almost, go back to the paper to make sure that I genuinely reflect SORA's intention. The objective is that UAS operations would not create a risk to third parties any different or any higher than crewed aviation, and as generally accepted by societies. So TLOS for ground risk is 1 fatality per million flying hours. For air risk, there are 2 metrics. One is air risk when operating in airspace where there are no ANSPs, and then the maximum fatality or mid-air collision rather is less than 1 mid-air collision per 10 million flying hours. And when operating in an airspace volume where separation is provided by an ANSP, the maximum number of mid-air collision is 1 per billion flying hours. So how do you meet that target level of safety? Well, you meet the TLOS by meeting a safety assurance and integrity level, or SAIL, that is proportionate to your operations risk. That is, if you operate what is considered a relatively low risk operation, still within the specific category, for example, SAIL 1 and 2, as you see in that little table, meaning your final ground risk is maximum 3 out of 10, and your maximum air risk is A or B out of D, then it means that the level of risk of your operation is considered relatively low, and the requirement is that you meet a 1 or 2 level of assurance and integrity level. The higher the risk, the higher the burden on the operator side to prove that he, she, they, the organization meets a higher level of SAIL. So SAIL is split into 6 levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, as you can see. 1 and 2 is the low end part of the specific category. 3 and 4, when the final ground risk is up to 5 and the air risk is up to C, is considered medium risk. Then you have of course 5 and 6 high risk, and beyond a ground risk of 7, it is considered that you operate outside of the specific category. You now belong to the certified category. Now, the next question in the methodology, in a way, is how do you meet the SAIL? How do you prove? How do you demonstrate? How do you reach that safety assurance and integrity level? You do so by meeting the operational safety objectives defined by SORA at the required level of robustness for your SAIL level. SORA has defined 18 OSOs, operational safety objectives, that are in relation to the duties or the requirements of the operator and or the training organization and or the manufacturer. And for example, if you operate under a SAIL 2 operation, then it means that for OSO 1, ensure the operator is competent and or proven. SAIL 2, you must demonstrate that OSO at a low level of robustness. SAIL 2, OSO 2, UAS manufactured by a competent authority, not required at SAIL 2, etc. So that is how you can demonstrate that you meet the required SAIL. You must demonstrate that you can meet every single of the 18 OSOs at the required level of robustness. So I mentioned the notion of robustness, and maybe we'll spend a moment detailing it in case it is not a familiar notion. Robustness is a combination of integrity and assurance. Integrity is, in a way, the amount of safety gains that you expect from a specific OSO or from a risk mitigation. How safer is your operation once you implement that risk mitigation or that ozone. And then the other notion is the assurance level of that ozone. It means its reliability. How reliable, how sure are you that you will get that safety gain when and where you need it? Robustness is then a combination of assurance and integrity. And also you have an increase in level of robustness from low, medium to high level of robustness, depending on the level of achievements for a combination of the assurance and integrity. In other words, to move from a low level of robustness to a medium level of robustness, you must demonstrate both a medium level of assurance, the safety gain, and a medium level of integrity, the reliability of that gain. Generally speaking, to demonstrate a low level of robustness, you must essentially declare that you meet that level. So it's self-declaration by the drone operator when submitting its SORA application. To demonstrate a medium level of robustness, you must provide proof, facts, evidence, data, experience. And then to demonstrate a high level of robustness, you must provide a validation of that proof by a third party. Oh, sorry. So if you allow me, jumping to one of the key conclusions of the whole SORA process is that for many operators, the initial objective will be to operate within SAIL 2. And that means a final ground risk of maximum 3 and a residual airspace risk class or A or B. If when going through the process, you realize that actually your SAIL is higher than 3, then first our initial recommendation would be to work on your risk mitigations, as we will discover them in a moment, or maybe work on the maximum robustness of all the different ozos that you can demonstrate so that you can actually fit into a SAIL 2. And the reason why I'm saying that is that even if your organization as a drone operator or your remote pilots in terms of competencies or the training organizations can indeed demonstrate a higher level of robustness or a higher level of robustness for their specific ozos, you may realize that the UAS itself may not meet their own requirements when you move beyond SAIL 2 to 3 and beyond. In the little table on the right-hand side, you can see that some of the letters in terms of the level of robustness of the SAIL for the different ozos are in red. Some SAILs are in yellow, and these are my very personal, so I'm not an aviation expert, so it's a personal assessment that actually getting those ozos at that level may be challenging, especially for those that are purely under the responsibility of the manufacturer. Because as an operator, when you submit to SORA, you do not necessarily have that documentation from the manufacturer. For example, in Europe, where EASA implement SORA 2.0 and will continue with 2.5, a SAIL 4 UAS requirement is subject to a design verification report, DVR, delivered by EASA itself. And it used to be the case for SAIL 3 UAS requirements as well, up until literally last October. EASA published an amendment to the AMCGM last October, so that now the drone operator can actually, in a way, self-declare meeting SAIL 3 UAS-related requirements to their National Aviation Authority, even if they do not have in hand a DVR by EASA. Okay, so it's getting softer, less difficult for SAIL 3 to meet the UAS manufacturer's requirement in Europe, but it doesn't mean that the same applies in other countries, and it doesn't mean it will apply in the UK. In the UK, flight worthiness and the setting up of organizations that would validate those flight worthiness requirements will kick in at some point in the midterm, let's say maybe 2026, whereas the UK has as a target to implement that UK version of SORA in 2024. So there is, first, there is a gap when I guess there cannot be a UK version of that validation, or maybe the UK will have a different approach to flight worthiness on sales 3. Maybe they will accept some validation by third-party countries. I mean, we don't know. So just to mention it, and just to mention that regardless of what the UK CAA is saying, actually the burden is more on the UAS manufacturer. And at the moment, on a worldwide basis, there are very, very few UAS manufacturers who've been through the equivalent of a DVR or an equivalent. I should mention that in Canada, there are some solutions, actually. Canada follows SORA, and they have a mechanism where they provide a scheme for UAS with essentially parachutes under following ASTM standards. And that way, it's a way for US operators to meet higher sales, to operate beyond sale 2. Now that I've been through the general process and I've shared with you that essential element with regards to the the sale 2 that can be achieved on a routine basis, let's actually walk through the methodology. So the methodology is made of 10 steps. The first step is to define your concept of operations. Then you identify your intrinsic ground risk. You then identify a strategic and tactical risk mitigation to your ground risk so that you determine your final ground risk. You do the same for the airspace. You identify your initial air risk class. You mitigate the risk in order to strategic and tactical, in order to determine your residual airspace risk class. And based on the combination of your final ground risk, final air risk, you determine your sale. Based on the sale level, you've seen that you can determine the robustness level that you must achieve for each of the 18 OZOs. There is an element, step 9, that I haven't discussed yet with you, because it is very important, but it will complicate the picture. And actually, the evolutions from 2.0 and 2.5, I think, will evolve. My reading of it is that it's been pretty conservative in version 2.5, and the requirements in terms of containment for the adjacent airspace are still under review. Once you've been through the entire process, the step number 10 is to actually gather the documentation so that you have a complete and comprehensive safety portfolio, which is your SORA application. So let's start with the quantification of the ground risk. And the first thing, of course, is to identify the ground footprint and the air footprint, where you have to actually assess what is your risk class. SORA refers to its semantic model. So the first key notion is the operational volume. The operational volume is the combination of your flight geography, where your flight takes place, plus a contingency volume in case for one reason or another, the drone exits the flight geography, but the remote pilot is in a position to drive it back or put it back into the flight geography. In terms of the airspace risk, that is the airspace volume reference for the air risk class. So it's a flight geography plus a contingency. On the ground, it's a bit different. SORA provides for an additional buffer called the ground risk buffer. That ground risk buffer starts at the border of the contingency volume, so at the border of the operational volume. And the idea is that in the event that the drone exits the operational volume, then you want the UA to land or crash within that ground risk buffer. And that footprint on the ground, is the reference ground footprint to assess the ground risk class. So if we go into the ground risk class, you see in the bubble that the default size of the ground risk buffer is based on the one-to-one principle, which I guess everybody is familiar with now. So if you fly at, say, 60 meters altitude, then your ground risk buffer as a default should be 60 meters. It's also important to note that a smaller ground risk buffer may be proven for a rotary wing UA using a ballistic methodology accepted by the National Aviation Authority. And we'll go through an example of ballistic methodology accepted by the Swiss CAA at the end of the process. Now let's define the intrinsic ground risk. That IGRC is based on 3 criteria. 2 criteria are based on the UAS itself, because it's a way to measure the kinetic energy in a way of an impact, and then essentially the lethality of a potential crash. So the 2 metrics are the drone's dimension, its width in meters, and its maximum cruise speed in meter per second. That maximum cruise speed is not the cruise speed during that particular flight. It's a maximum cruise speed as determined by the manufacturer in its technical spec. So it's a conservative approach where you look at the maximum cruise speed as per technical spec. It doesn't count if you fly at 2 meters per second during that particular operation. That's not the reference as per SORA. The third metric is the maximum population density measured in people per square kilometer. So that metric is essentially looking at the number of people at risk. And you see that there are, I think, 7 bands for maximum population density. So if we take an example, you see here, initial version. So the version of 2.5 that was issued in March. If you operate a drone of max 1 meter width, a max speed of 25 meters per second in an area where the density is below 25,000 per people per square kilometer, qualified as urban, then your intrinsic ground risk is 6. You will notice a little note with 4 stars on this page to mention that drones with a mass less than 250 grams are benefit of an IGRC intrinsic ground risk of 1, meaning they're harmless wherever you operate them. Now, let me share with you a possible update. And again, it's possible, it's not final, there may be some changes. So the main changes compared to the initial versions are that the density band for the population at risk shifted from bands of multiples of 2.5 to 50. And that means that if you look at urban, it used to be maximum 25,000 people. Now it's maximum 50,000 people. You can also notice that urban is now the 6th band for population density. It used to be 5th. The other change is that the maximum intrinsic GRC, if you operate in a controlled ground area, is 3. That is, you remain within cell 3. Cell 2, sorry. Oh, cell 2, apologies. If you operate within a controlled ground area, even if you have a larger aircraft, you remain within a ground risk, intrinsic ground risk of 3, meaning cell 2. Looking at some examples, looking at metrics from the ONS, I don't know whether the ONS census population density map will be the final reference tool selected by the CAA, but I guess it's a good starting point. Looking at an operation, let's say in Swindon, the cell with the maximum density that I identified was with a maximum density of 17,000 people per square kilometers. It means that in the initial version, the intrinsic ground risk class is 6 and onwards in the initial version and also in the updated version. But if you look at Bristol, higher density city, Some cells have a density of 40,000 people, meaning that in the initial version of 2.5, that would have qualified as an initial intrinsic ground risk class 7 and onwards. And in the possible update, it would be 6 and onwards. Now, once you have determined that intrinsic ground risk, you apply ground risk mitigations in order to lower your risk. I mean, what any operator does anyway for every operation. SORA defines precisely the ground risk mitigations that you can apply and the various degrees of robustness that you can apply them as well. And depending on the mitigations and the level of robustness, you can achieve a number of GRC reduction points. You can see here that there are initially 3 risk mitigations, and that overall you can achieve 2 points in GRC reduction at low robustness, meaning mostly through self-declaration by the operator, as opposed to providing an additional level of both assurance and integrity. If we go through the 3 mitigations, let's start with M1B, VLOS. Everybody knows it. -1 if you operate in VLOS. M1A, strategic mitigations for ground risk, means that you can reduce the number of people who are at risk. And there, depending on the level of robustness, you can achieve -1 up to -3. And the third mitigation is M2, effect of UA impact dynamics are reduced. So it's essentially reducing the impact of the drone in case of an impact. So typically that would be a parachute. Now, if you remember the little table, one of the challenges when I opened up that initial version is that, hang on, how on earth are we going to operate a regular smaller drone in VLOS in urban environment? Because you see that if you are urban or dense urban, you start at 6 or 7 with a smaller drone. You can achieve VLOS -1, strategic mitigation in terms of number of people on the ground -1 at low robustness, but then to return to achieve a GRC of 3, you need to add either an M2 being a parachute, or succeed in demonstrating M1A at a medium level of robustness. Now, among the possible updates is this table. You see that first M1A has been essentially split in 2 because the notion of sheltering has been split from the generic M1A mitigation as an M3. Sheltering is the idea that even if you have a certain level of density within an area, the reality is that very few people are actually outdoors, and there are many studies. They are actually listed as part of SORA. There are many studies that conclude that people are indoor 90% of the time, and so that is why you can, using those sheltering analysis, you can actually assess that you can decrease your risk by a level of 1. The other element within that table is that the level of robustness is increasing from low to high and high plus, and that overall, at a low level of robustness, you can achieve three points of ground risk reduction. It means, just again, only focusing on operation of a smaller drone in VLOS in an urban environment, you can actually reduce your ground risk by 3 points. And whether you operate in Swindon or Bristol, in my little example, and achieve SAIL 2. Now, let's spend a few moments on the meaning behind reducing the ground risk by 1 or reducing the sail risk by 1. Actually, when you navigate the table of the sail, left and right, top and down, it actually means that you reduce the failure or the fatality rate by 1 class, and 1 class means divided by 10. So the sail level have been designed and structured so that they match the operations failure rate. In other words, a sail level of 2 means that the maximum level of maximum rate of operations failure is 1 every 100 flying hours, or more accurately, that it's below sail 3, that is, it doesn't reach yet 1 every 1,000 flying hours. So it's not good enough, in other words, to apply mitigations that would reduce your risk by dividing by 2. You have to implicitly divide it by 10 each time you move from one sail to the next. Now let's move on to the airspace risk. And before, let me have a look at time. Yeah, we have already spent 30 minutes on our journey, so I'll try and accelerate on the airspace risk, especially because not much has changed between SORA 2.0 and 2.5. So the first element is to determine the volume of airspace, that is a reference for the ARC determination. As mentioned earlier, it is the operational volume. A few seconds to determine what is ARC. ARC is a way of categorizing the airspace based on the risk of a mid-air collision between a drone and a crewed aircraft. It's classified within A, B, C, and D, A being the lower risk, D being the higher risk. To determine your initial ARC level, you actually follow that little decision tree. We're not going to go through every single step of it. I'll just mention ARC A. You see the green star. It's ARC A is atypical airspace. And then the going up, ARC B in yellow, meaning you either fly above 60,000 feet, or you fly, you see at the bottom right, you fly below 500 feet in uncontrolled airspace over rural areas. For reference, we've included the definition of ARC A. We know that there's been a number of discussions on the definition as such of atypical airspace. Well, there is a definition that is approved by a large panel of brilliant and well-recognized aviation experts, including UK CAA experts. So I think it would be worthwhile to mention it. There is a definition of atypical airspace, and it's an airspace where the risk of collision between a UAS and manned aircraft is acceptably low, without the addition of any tactical mitigation. And that would include operations in reserved or restricted airspaces, or operations at very low altitude, including near obstacles, where manned aviation generally do not operate. Once you have identified your initial ARC, you can implement strategic ARC mitigations. But actually, this part is optional and it's work in progress. It will be covered in SORA 3.0. So I referenced the annex as part of the SORA process, which is available already as part of 2.0 if you would like to understand already what's possible in terms of strategic ARC mitigation. But let's first focus on what is better detailed for now, which are the tactical mitigations. There are two sets of tactical mitigations to reduce your risk ARC, your airspace risk class. The first one is VLOS, EVLOS. VLOS is considered as an acceptable tactical mitigation for all ARC levels. Of course, you still need to comply with obtaining prior approvals to fly into FRZ or any other airspace, restricted airspace. But in terms of the safety methodology developed by SORA, VLOS and EVLOS are acceptable tactical mitigation in any ARC level. EVLOS as well, you can see that to fly EVLOS in the different airspace class, you must, of course, fulfill the requirements of VLOS, plus there are a number of other requirements. You should go into details to get the complete picture. We just highlighted a few of them. One is a communication latency, maximum 15 seconds between the remote pilots and the observers, plus some code phraseology between the remote pilot and the observers, etc. If you do not fly VLOS or EVLOS, meaning you fly BVLOS, then you must implement another set of tactical mitigations, which are detect and avoid. So if you fly ARC-B, for example, sub 500 foot in uncontrolled airspace over rural areas, then you must implement tactical mitigations performance requirements at a low level of robustness. For your reference, we've included the key extracts of TMPR law as part of SORA. The slide deck will be made available, so you will have ample time to go through those. Otherwise, I would honestly encourage you to go through the documentation itself. Before moving to the next slide, I would like also to mention that JARUS published PDRA 05 not that long ago. I think it was honestly a few months ago, and that PDRA 05 is for BVLOS in unsegregated airspace over sparsely populated areas below 110 meters altitude. So that can be also a valuable source to understand the state of play under SORA to fly BVLOS in unsegregated airspace. Now, once you have identified your final ground risk and your residual ARC risk, as mentioned at the very beginning, you determine your final, your cell from 1 to 6. And as mentioned at the very beginning, once you have identified your cell, then you know at what level of robustness you must complete each of the 18 OZOs. I remind here again that any requirements on the manufacturer side should be considered with great attention, because it may be difficult to reach those OZOs at the required level of robustness. I had mentioned it at the very beginning. I mention it again. We are not covering today the containment in case of flyaway, but they are important and they may have a significant impact. But those requirements as part of 2.5 are under review, so let's not spend too much time. But keep in mind that measuring your adjacent area on the ground and in the air and the risk of having additional containment areas should be an element to watch closely. The final step is to combine the documentation and provide the ops manual, the compliance evidence, your proof that you're meeting the OZOs at the required level of robustness, and also documentation of your SORA process, including the compliance metrics. Now, I've been at a relatively fast pace, and apologies for that. We'll have maybe the opportunity to do additional sessions on specific topics. Now that I've been through the entire process, I'd like to make some additional remarks. The first remark is that the specific category is very broad, and probably it's because the idea is to allow as many operations to fit into the specific category as opposed to the certified category. If you look at the the final band in terms of the UAS characteristics in meters and maximum speed, well, actually 40-meter wingspan, maximum 200 meter per second speed yes, Global Hawk fit into that spec. And that is a big bird by 6 or 7 tons. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, a maximum 1 meter wingspan, maximum 25 meters second, 25 meter per second speed, when actually the end of the open category could be a drone as small as 251 grams, just not fitting into the open cat. So it is a very, very large spectrum. And that means that when we go specifically for specific operations in one specific column, to a certain extent, there may be a need for additional layer of granularity or judgment to really fit into the specificities of your operation. The other remark I'd like to make is the audience, the user base is also very diverse. SORA is talking to a very diverse audience. It's implemented on a national basis, on an international basis, and the different nations across the world have varying degree of awareness or track record of implementing drone or UAS regulations. In some countries, there is no regulation in reference to UAS at all. There is no training syllabus. There is no, there is nothing yet. They start from scratch. So obviously, it means that for JARUS and in developing SORA, the approach, I mean, we can say, may be considered as proportionate, but conservative. And it's a personal opinion. It's up to each national CAA to implement SORA with a certain degree of assessment of where they stand in terms of track record of national regulation and track record of education and training of their own population, their own user base. Another remark is that SORA is meant to be local and mission specific because it all starts with the assessment of the ground risk and the air risk in a particular location. It means that under SORA, you submit a SORA application for every mission. And in Europe, where it is implemented, or in other countries, it is essentially the case. It's like a SORA process. It's like an OSC, a kind of OSC process. It's although no, it's actually different because here it's mission by mission. For lower cell, meeting the requirements, as we've seen, is based on a self-declaration of compliance by the operator. So the process can be quick because you can, as an operator, you can have all your documentation standardized and ready, and the process can be digitized, but at the end of the day, you still have to do it for every mission. So what I've encountered as an approach for different in different countries, some countries are considering developing an equivalent of a generic SORA or developing some kind of generic or specific CONOPS, sorry, to provide the basis of a generic SORA so that you do not have to provide an application for every mission. Other countries have defined a kind of first application that is reviewed by the CAA oversight teams, and then afterwards, for each mission, you submit a change request when you are operating in a different location. JARUS and some member states, some members or some countries have defined what we call standard scenarios or PDRAs. But the key message behind this page is that essentially the full SORA process should be ideally the exception and not the norm. And we need to develop generic SORAs or PDRAs or standard scenarios, whatever the vocabulary that is acceptable, but that is fit for purpose, so that operators do not have to submit an approval for every operation on the lower cell type of applications. Another additional remark, and I'll be very quick because we have only 15 minutes left, and I do want to hear your questions. You will have noticed that SORA does not ban overflight. Overflight is mitigated, it is not banned. In terms of the ground footprint, so where, where that question may be raised, the default method is the ground risk buffer of 1:1, but you can use a ballistic methodology in case you operate a rotary uncrewed aircraft. And then you see with the different ground risk mitigations that you apply ground risk so that you lower your risk, but not down to controlled ground area. It's different. And actually, SORA provides for BVLOS operations where obviously controlled ground area is just not realistic anyway. 2 seconds on that example of a ballistic approach. That little extract on the left-hand side is an extract from the Scaillierez, the FOCA guidance material on how to apply for an operational authorization based on SORA. And by applying the, it's a standard ballistic formula, you see that if your maximum cruise speed during the mission is actually relatively low because you're doing data capture at a low height and at a low speed, then you see that the ballistic approach provides for a ground risk buffer, which is probably much lower than the 1:1. Because if I take an example, if you fly 50 meters at 4-meter speed, then that means 13 meters through the ballistic approach, as opposed to 50 meters, 50-50 through the 1:1 methodology. My final slide is having a look at the PDRA SO1 that has been published by EASA. So EASA is not JARUS, it's different, but it gives an idea of the implementation of the overall SORA methodology for lower sail operations on a standard approach, and that is PDRA SO1. So a few remarks. In terms of the ground risk buffer size, you see that they are implementing a kind of ballistic approach with a min and max. So if we look in terms of the columns, you have less than 10 kilos drones, or 10 to 25 kilo drones, and then the height is less than 30 meters up to 150 meters. If we look at an example of a drone of mass below 10 kilos, it means that the minimum ground risk buffer is 10 meters, going to 30 meters. But actually, if you operate at, say, a maximum height of 60 meters, then that ground risk buffer is 15 meters. Then the protection of ground third parties on the ground in that area is controlled ground area. The remote pilot training, it's a very important topic, because actually, whether you look at SORA, the complete process, or its application by EASA, actually the remote pilot competency is, I think, less than what we have in the UK in the specific category with the JVC, because it is self-declaration by the operator, in particular in terms of the training part on the practical training. Now, that PDRA SO1 published by EASA, I understand, has currently a relatively low level of adoption. It could be because it is still the early days. It could be because it is relatively conservative. There is this issue of controlled ground area. I mean, some would say that implementing a controlled ground area in an urban environment is actually being non-compliant from the minute you take off. And it could be also because the training and the definition of the training to implement that scenario, that PDRA, sorry, and the availability of that training may not be completely developed yet. The other point is that in a number of countries in EASA, there are some national scenarios, and they are still applicable until 2026. So that those countries where, like in the UK, there is already a population of operators in the specific category. They are already trained under a national syllabus, operating under the national PDRAs. They have not migrated yet to the new formula because they don't need to do it until 2026. That is essentially covering most of the topics I wanted to discuss. I think that point I've just expressed right here, right now, may resonate with a number of people, especially in the context of the approach to CAP 722H and the issue in terms of overflight in the UK. So clearly, in that PDRA SO1, there are some good elements, starting by some formula for the ballistic approach if you operate a smaller drone. But I mean, my personal opinion is that the remote pilot training in the UK is much more serious because it is theoretical and practical training validated by an approved third party, meaning high level of robustness. And there is a track record for over 10 years, actually, between the PIFCO and GVC, which is an evolution of the same thing. I think we have nearly 10 years of track record of proof of competency in the UK. So with that final word, yes, final word, Mohammed, I haven't looked at all into the Q&A, into the chat. Now, maybe if you can let me know, or let us know if there are any questions, or hopefully some people will would like to raise a couple of questions after that overview. I know it's dense and I know it's very new for many people. So actually, I would understand if for now people tend to be reflecting on the input as opposed to questioning or commenting.
Yeah, it seems like the audience is a little shy at the moment, but like you said, they might be. Oh, we've got a question in. Do you see the CAA following this?
Yes, the CAA announced repeatedly that they would be adopting a UK version of SORA. For now, it's in the course of 2024. Now, they depend on the publication of the JARUS version of 2.5. The initial date was for that JARUS publication was end of 2023, which is why the UK CAA had in mind 2024. Now, the schedule is shifting, but let's assume that it will take place at some point in 2024.
Okay, excellent. Another question. Where can we get training? Are RAEs working on this already?
My answer would be, I don't know. I am pretty sure that a number of RAEs in the UK operate already internationally, and actually they follow SORA or they support operators outside of the UK, if you want, to implement SORA. So the answer is that yes, some UK RAEs already are familiar with SORA and they are in a position to help you. But I think that the whole process of implementing a UK version of SORA and the training behind it will take place as maybe next year or maybe the following year.
Okay, a comment on that. Yes, RAEs are. I think that containment is important. I understand why you skipped it, but no harm to explain what containment is, and that FTS is the most common means if compliance, especially if adjacent areas airspace are urban or ARC-D airspace. Most operators will want this, so need to start understanding containment. EASA have strict MOC for FTS now, and it is hard to meet requirements as few, if any, systems meet MOCs. So thank you very much for that input.
Yeah. So yes, and the thing is, you see, so it was already hard to put everything within the hour, and I didn't want to scare people away because the reality is that little calculations of what's behind version 2.5 was an increase in the adjacent area. My reading of it is 2.1, 2.0, sorry, is essentially 1 kilometer. My reading of 2.5 as it was initially published is 5 kilometers away from, so that's the size of your adjacent area. And then in the air, I think I calculate something like 3 to 5 kilometers in the air. And then very quickly you had some containment requirements, which I fully agree can be challenging because you need FTS, means flight termination systems, and very few UAS meet that requirement, and so you're stuck because there are no drones on the market meeting that requirement. And I think that is currently under review. We will definitely monitor it. Maybe we should do a specific session just to debate that one. Fully agree. Maybe only just looking at 2.0 and 2.5.
Okay, next question. What will happen to people with OSC and the conversion to SORA? How long will OSC have currency against SORA?
So I don't know the answer. It's something we should ask the CAA. I would say that there will be a transition period, because there is always a transition period. I know that in Europe they had that transition, but I mean, the thing is, I cannot speak for the CAA. I think it is one of the topics we must discuss with the CAA when they move to SORA, so that the operators have time to adapt.
Okay. We have a question. I have PDRA01. Will this mirror across with grandfather rights?
That's the whole question behind the last slide on describing PDRA SO1, because the thing is, and I think that is the case for Ireland. Ireland had a history of drone operator and activities. I mean, we all know they do plenty of things in Ireland. I think my reading is they as good boys, as part of EASA, they migrated their national scenario, or PDRA, if you want, to that PDRA SO1 EASA. And actually, my understanding is that possibly they have lost a number of operators en route because it was more conservative than their national approach. And the challenge that I have with the PDRA SO1 is that it provides for controlled ground area, which in many instances is not so much realistic, and it means that the operator is very quickly non-compliant. So I find it easy to put it on the operator, the burden of implementing a controlled ground area, and especially when the specific category operators in the UK have a JVC that is much better. My reading of it, but we're going to look into it. Next step is to look into the details of the training under that PDRA in JARUS or in EASA, because my reading is that the population, the audience in the UK is much better trained than what's required for that standard. And so for me, it would make sense that because we have a higher degree of training, we could have, for example, a PDRA where the operator can implement some of those ground risk mitigations without going down to the risk or to the control ground area status. I hope I was clear. So I mean, yes, that's the whole point of that overflight. The business of overflight is essentially the question behind it.
Interesting. Yes, and a comment has come in on that. Experience in Ireland is that the operational authorization issued based on SORA are to be of a generic type, and applications to all locations meeting the original SORA CON-OP and operational authorization, normally valid for 2 years. Certainly that is the case with sub 10 kg drones, might influence the CAA as they have been working closely with the IAA. So thank you for that comment. So more of a suggestion than a question, but it would be good to run through some of the examples of current types of operation through SORA to see what the implications would be for current drone operators. What do you think about that, Anne-Lise?
Yeah, I think it would make sense. What is challenging is that we don't know yet what will be 2.5. The tables that I showed in terms of ground risk, they are not old, they are 2 weeks old. And considering that they have to go through all the pipes of approval as part of JARUS, I suppose that they won't change drastically, but we don't know. I think as a next step, it would be probably valuable to reach out to some of members or, I mean, people we know who are part of JARUS working groups. And so we will have a flavor, if you want, whether that is a final version, and then walk through examples with typically, VLOS urban and then BVLOS. I mean, the thing is, we should look at BVLOS, but because the whole point of SORA is to provide a framework where it will open up to BVLOS. So I fully agree. The webinar forum, the webinar format is such that I don't know who is asking questions, and we can't exchange. But definitely, as a next step, we can definitely set up something that is more interactive. Yes. And discuss those questions.
Absolutely.
And also, before I interrupt you, Mohammed, any feedback of countries where they have implemented a kind of generic SORA is of course very useful, because that way we can leverage these in our discussions or exchange of information with the CAA.
Excellent. Another question's come in. EASA are working on the LUC generic SORA approach, and what we believe is an intermediate stage, like a mini LUC. Is the CAA looking at the LUC approach for the UK?
So I'm not competent. I don't know. I'm not sure. What I can tell you is that when I attended that conference in Germany, I was actually surprised. It is mentioned that actually in the new framework with that PDRA, etc., it's really not clear to me to what extent there is proper specific category training in the different countries. I'm just talking EASA. I don't know for other countries. Because in the numbers of remote pilot competency, I think the absolute vast majority were actually A2 COC certificate opening in the OpenCat. Actually, one of the key conclusions already, Gerald, is that a lot of operators try to fly in the OpenCat as opposed to specific CAT. And it's not clear to me whether there are a lot of RAE equivalent in Europe offering today an STS training. I mean, we know of Julia Garland in Ireland. I don't know if she's got competitors, if you want. Not sure. And so before talking look or mini look, I think the basic would be to start by inquiring where they stand on that front. Essentially, having an offer for training in the lower risk cell 1 and 2 specific category.
Excellent. Next question is, good upside to a lot of this, and glad you mentioned predefined SORA, as I was getting concerned about getting approval for each mission given the OSC delays I keep hearing about. EVLOS is of most interest to me. Is there a time frame for when this could come in? How long is a piece of string, I imagine, for now?
So EVLOS will come with the rest. That is, the UK would accept. I think it would accept SORA 2.5 as another means to comply with regulation. Maybe it will still accept also the old regime, by the way. I don't know. Maybe the two could be different ways to comply with regulation. I mean, I'm not a legal expert. So I would say EVLOS would come with the rest of the package. What I don't know is whether the UK version of SORA would have some tweaks when it comes to EVLOS. I don't know. Hopefully not.
Excellent. That's perfect. There is one comment who's come in, but it's anonymous, and so I don't know who you are. If you could drop us an email on what you've requested, then we can get back to you on that. And that concludes the questions. Thank you very much.
All right, brilliant. Thank you, Mohammed, for being a wonderful host. Thank you, everybody.